Wait, can I ask you a question before you jump in? Let me ask you a question. What podcast number will this be for you, roughly? I know you might want to.
Let me see. Do you want an actual answer?
No, I want ballpark.
141.
141. I just wanted to know in your roster where I ranked, because I have not appeared. This is my first time appearing on this show. And so I'm on your 141st episode. And multiple people. Joan Williams has appeared multiple times. Laksha Jain has been on multiple times.
To be very clear, this is not my first time asking you. You were like on a moratorium for podcast. What was it, like a cleanse? Like what happened?
I was cocooning.
Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Drew. The parties and their coalitions have changed a lot during the decade that Trump has dominated American politics. Looking back on the 10 years of data, though, there's one change that sticks out as particularly profound. According to Pew's validated voter data, Latinos went from voting for Democrats by 38 points in 2016 to voting for them by just 3 points in 2024. Democrats, of course, lost the presidency both of those years, but in ways that looked quite different. That 35-point swing to the right amongst Latino voters is a larger shift than any other age, race, gender, or education-based change in the American electorate during that time. Now, while other data suggests a slightly smaller swing than Pew, no matter the source, that superlative holds. Gone with Democrats' lock on Latino voters is also the 20-teens' wisdom that the issue of immigration is the key to their vote. It turns out Republicans were probably right to tear up that 2012 postmortem that suggested Republicans couldn't win Latino voters without moderating on the issue. The question now is how much of this trend will stick. Was 2024 the high watermark for Republican Latino support, or is this a decades, not just decade-long trend? And are recent shifts towards Democrats the tides turning or an overinterpretation of small turnout in off-cycle elections? Lucky for us, longtime friend of the pod, Carlos Odio, has set out to make sense of the trends of the last decade and where they point to next in his new Substack called The New Dynamic. Carlos is the co-founder of Equis Research, and he's here with me now. Welcome to the podcast, Carlos.
Hello, Galen. It is so good to finally be here.
I know regular on the forebear. It's taken a while to get you on the actual GD Politics podcast. I know you had like a podcast moratorium or whatever, but you're here and that's all that matters now. And you're also on Substack. Congratulations. Your first piece was great, by the way. And for folks who regularly listen to the GD Politics podcast, I just want to give you a plug, Carlos. The piece that you wrote, if that's any indication of what's to come, fantastic stuff. It's like no bullshit. It's really transparent about even places where you or your colleagues and other researchers of the Latino vote have been wrong. And it's honest about what we know from the data, what we don't know. So for people who are looking for a lack of spin and not cheerleading for one party or the other, go to The New Dynamic. And I just want to ask you, why are you doing this? Sort of why now?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words. And yes, we set for ourselves a high bar in our first introduction, and now we have to kind of deliver, and that is what is to come. This is, you mentioned, I was cocooning. There was a period of time where I wasn't doing podcasts, I wasn't talking to anybody, and it was because my co-writer, co-author, our chief scientist at Equis, Rachel Stein, and I, we'd gone in after the 2024 election and said, let's do what we did after 2020, what we did after 2022, which is write a postmortem. What happened with Latino voters in the 2024 election? And in some ways, the answer was, how do I put this? Boring. Like what actually happened in the last few months of the campaign was actually not that interesting. But when you started pulling the threads, you realized that there was the need to step back and say, what happened in the last 4 months is not why Donald Trump was able to gain 16 points in vote share from 2016 to 2024 among Latino voters, going from 30% Latino voters to something like 46%. You had to step back and say, what is it about this decade? What is it about the Trump era? What forces were unleashed? And how do we understand Latinos in context? Because, a temptation, especially for us, a limitation of the Equis data. Look, I think the Equis data is pretty damn good. However, it has its limitations. A big honking one is that we poll Latinos. And so putting comparisons to other parts of the electorate to understand where Latinos are unique and where they're just like everybody else is a challenge if you're just looking at our polls. We only started the organization in 2019, me and my co-founder, Stephanie Valencia. So anything prior to 2019, we don't have our own data to rely on. So if you want to give the context historically, are Donald Trump's numbers the highest that Republicans have ever gotten among Latinos? You got to go beyond. And this began a rabbit hole process of going through and saying, what have we missed? What is it we got wrong? What is it others have gotten wrong? What are assumptions we've made that probably need to be revisited? What are bigger questions that need to be answered in this moment? And New Dynamic is an effort to say, look, we don't have yet all the answers, but we're going to wrestle with these things in front of you. We're going to share what we have learned in this process, because I think there are some bigger things that surprised me. And so the New Dynamic in many ways is a chronicle of the things that me and Rachel have learned, the things that have surprised us in this process, because we think it's meaningful, not just in terms of understanding Latino voters as Latino voters, but understanding the dynamism in the American electorate. What is changing and why?
To set the stakes here for how much sway Latino voters have in the electorate, I'll just lay the numbers out. Latinos are 20% of the American population, 15% of eligible voters, and about 11% of actual voters in 2024. We'll get into the partisan fighting over that group, but how do you see those numbers evolving in the coming years?
Well, obviously, the geographic distribution is not even, right? So you have, at a statewide level, the states that are especially Latino, right? Where you are not winning in Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, California, et cetera, without Hispanics in the mix. And then you have states where the share is growing, whether it's, or it has grown, right? So Pennsylvania now has a meaningful share, even if it's not decisive in most election scenarios. The Wisconsins, the Michigans, the Georgias of the world all have some kind of population along these lines. But you have states that we don't talk about as much, but a Utah, a Kansas, where a growing Latino vote will over time be a meaningful factor in the electorate. And then you have down ballot, right? So the House map in 2026 is actually uniquely Latino. So Latinos are about 13% of eligible voters nationally. Of eligible voters in the competitive districts, they're 20%. You have districts that are competitive because of Hispanics, because of the shifts that happened in the Trump era. Some of this is the rewriting, the redrawing of lines in a Texas, for example, that's bumped some of those seats into competitive territory. But some of it's just the natural flow, like where the energy is, where there are votes to be contested, leads you to more Hispanic seats. And so, the way I'd put it is if you look at the top 36 most competitive House seats, you have 20 that are at least 10% Hispanic. But there are at least 12 that are at least 20% Hispanic. And why that matters is because we think of Nevada, right, as a very Hispanic state. When we think of presidential states, we think of Nevada as like the cornerstone, right? Now the Democrats were just debating where Nevada was going to fall in the order of primary states, because Nevada is a heavily Latino state. Well, Nevada is about 20% Latino. So in the House map in 2026, you have a dozen seats that are essentially Nevadas. You have a dozen Nevadas in the House map. And so depending on which level you're looking at, we don't have to talk about Latino impact in the future tense. We got used to this like cursed metaphor of the sleeping giant, that one day Latinos were going to wake up and start impacting American elections. It's already happening. The turnout rate has not grown, but the population has grown so much that the share of Latino voters has grown in every single election. So there's still much more potential vote because the rates haven't increased. The rates still lag behind other parts of the electorate. And yet the share of voters that is Latino continues to grow and is already meaningful today. You don't have to think about what's it going to be quite in the future, because the future will probably be a whole nother hybrid version of what we've seen in the past.
I think folks have struggled pretty badly to understand what has taken place over the past 10 years. I have some narratives that I want to debunk. I know that you've also debunked some narratives. So before we sort of talk about the present and the future, let's sorry, folks, to drag it all back to 2016, but I mean, Donald Trump is still president after all. What are some misconceptions about how this decade has played out?
It's helpful, I think, to think in terms of eras, because, I think we think of the Latino vote and we think of our understanding of it and think it's always been the same way, when there's really been a bunch of different eras. By the way, you can stretch those back to, when the Mexicans in the Southwest became Americans through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. But there's all these eras of voting in the Hispanic vote. And 2006, 2008 was a turning point. The Obama election, not just because of Obama, it was a confluence of events. Among them, that you had immigrant Latinos coming into the electorate. So for the first time, the population was plurality immigrant. Before that point, it had been predominantly actually third generation, multi-generation. You had these big waves of immigration, late 90s into the 2000s, and all of a sudden that comes to a head in 2006, 2008. And so a lot of things happen at the same time, and the Obama era created what became the conventional wisdom among Hispanic voters. The way we thought about immigration, because you had this big immigration moment in 2006, these big marches, because of the incredibly high support for Barack Obama, which then meant that Latinos were kind of drafted into this Obama coalition, and the idea of an emerging Democratic majority or a rising Democratic majority, or whatever you wanted to call it, at that point. And so we got this idea of Latinos as a base vote, Latinos as heavily influenced by immigration, because the ones who were coming into the electorate really were. It was their top issue. 2012 did nothing to really dispel that notion. If you were looking under the surface, you already could see that there were warning signs. And then 2016 seemed to almost cement it, because Donald Trump only gets 30% of the Hispanic vote. So what happened in the Trump era was ushering us into a whole new pivot point, into a whole new era that shared similarities with the past, but now had new dimensions, where we had to think about immigration very differently. We had to think about the priorities of the electorate very differently. We had to think about partisanship very differently.
We've had a lot of conversations over the years, and as somebody who has spent that entire decade looking at poll after poll after poll, I have sought out explanations and sometimes gotten them while the story is still being told. And so I have sympathy for an explanation or a narrative that doesn't always pan out. But I want to just sort of go back in time a little bit. So, because those stories of what has been going on have been all over the place. After 2012, the story was Republicans need to moderate on immigration to win Latinos. In 2016, there were all of these predictions that Trump would crater with Latinos because of his message on immigration, but it looked like he might have actually done a little bit better with Latinos than Romney, or at least stayed the same despite the harshness of his rhetoric. And at the time, activist groups said, this probably isn't true. He maybe even did worse. There's no chance he did better, et cetera, et cetera. After 2020, the message was that the pandemic created maybe more focus on the economy instead of immigration. And so that change in emphasis helped Trump with Latino voters. And also, by the way, if you look back at George W. Bush, Latino voters seem to have this preference for incumbent presidents and vote for the incumbent at higher rates than the rest of the electorate. Then in 2022, the midterm message is that, well, at least sort of Democrats have stopped the bleeding, and we're in this pandemic era dynamic, and we may well hold there until sort of we get out of the pandemic era. Then in 2024, after promising mass deportation and the like, the bottom falls out for Democrats. Trump wins nearly half of Latinos nationally and a clear majority in states like Texas and Florida. And it seems like at this point, there's no explaining away this one-off thing or the particularities of the pandemic or an incumbent or what have you. Donald Trump pitches the most extreme immigration policies of probably anyone's lifetime voting in the 2024 election. Although maybe that's overwrought, because both parties kind of agreed to some extent on harsher immigration policies in the 90s and whatnot, or early 2000s. But anyway, sort of looking back, it was always like, well, it's probably this, it's probably not. And in some ways, it's almost like the activist groups themselves don't want to admit what seems to be happening, particularly on the left, that Latino voters are moving over to Trump and the Republicans. Why was this so hard to understand while it was happening?
There's a lot there, Galen. And I will start with, there's nobody who could have sat in January 2017 and would have told you. You can't go back in time and find a sane observer of political trends who would have predicted what would happen among Latino voters.
For sure.
And so we can explain it now, but it wasn't predictable then.
Yeah.
Our theories were ill-equipped to the moment. And it was for various reasons. Again, we'd had very high support in the Obama years. The voters who were coming into the electorate were heavily Democratic. It was such a young electorate, as you've pointed out. We got used to the idea that young people were just Democrats, especially the millennials, were a heavily Democratic generation. Everything seemed to be pointing in that direction. And so you have Trump come into power. In the 2018, I will amend some of things. In the midterm of 2018, Democrats do better with Latinos even than they did in 2016 at a national level in the House races. They got 71% per catalyst at the U.S. House level in 2018. Now, if you were paying attention, you would have seen warning signs for Democrats in spots, right? In Florida, the best example. If it weren't for the Florida, Stephanie and I wouldn't have started Equis. Florida showed to us that there was something else going on that required more understanding because Bill Nelson and Andrew Gillum and down ballot candidates had underperformed the blue wave among Hispanic voters. You saw a decline from 2016. You saw spots in like Texas. You saw spots in like there were elements in a place like Nevada. And then 2020 happens where Donald Trump makes his first gains. And there's a few things. I don't think we ever properly understood the ideology of Latino voters, that you did have a set who were truly conservative, but who had been holding back from voting for Republicans. And there was a sense that, well, why would Donald Trump be the one who wins them back? And I think the mistake we make is also just trying to make it just seem about Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump is a political entrepreneur who is taking advantage of larger forces at play. Donald Trump coincides with and helps, he is both driving and riding these larger forces in the electorate where you have, the highly touted kind of global status, class status realignments. You have changes in media that are changing what people's social networks look like at a given moment, where, across actually all the Western democracies that we can look at where you'd seen this cleavage start opening up, minorities had kind of held back, right? You would say, well, working class native voters were all moving to the right, more college-educated voters moving to the left, and then minorities were kind of sticking with the left out of some traditional sense, and Latinos were part of that. So you had all these ways in which Latinos were kind of constrained, were holding back, and yet at some point, the dam could break. We just couldn't foresee all the conditions in which it would happen. And what had happened is that Donald Trump, kind of the economy under Trump, unlocked the door. We forget now, but the lowest point for prices in the last 15 years was from 2017 to 2019. It was the lowest point of Hispanic unemployment in recorded history, modern history. You had all of the gains from the Great Recession, right? The recovery from Great Recession that started under Obama really comes to a head then in Trump's first term, where Hispanic wealth has grown tremendously. Relative wage growth has gone up. And so you're seeing a more conservative Latino who all of a sudden has a justification to go Republican. And so that's the vanguard that kind of breaks open this dam, right? And there's a variety of other forces that get unleashed after that, right? You have the 2020 election. There were many of us asking how permanent or temporary is this? The ones who shifted at that point seemed like they would stay. Would Republicans make additional gains beyond that? 2022, they didn't. But Biden's first term, and we could talk about it, the crises of the Biden's first term, were almost tailor-made to hit a certain segment of Latino voters in a way that unleashed even greater flow in the rightward direction.
I've had Joan Williams on this podcast a couple times, who you've even emailed me being like, "Oh, I listened to the podcast with Joan Williams," so I know that you're familiar with
Love Joan Williams.
Her work. And she talks about basically working class voters, working class Americans being somewhat allergic to the way that Democrats talk about the world on a whole host of different issues, ranging from economic to social. How much of the problem that Democrats have had with Latino voters is simply the problem that Democrats have had with working class voters across the board, but there's just been further to travel for Latino voters because they started so much further to the left?
That's a great way to think about it, which is, yes, it is the same dynamics, just it came late to Latinos. There's this idea of post-materialism, right? That as you had increasing secularization, urbanization in the world, you had women coming into the workplace, you had lower marriage rates, that all of a sudden a different set of priorities emerges among like a college-educated class that is about rights and democracy. It's about the environment. It's about these post-material concerns. And then you have in reaction to that, people who are still, their interests are primarily material. They're about prices, they're about the economy, they're about providing and protecting for their families and taking care of the interests of their own, which is another way to say is nationalism. There's a nationalist reaction to this. And so you hadn't really seen that among Latinos, but you all of a sudden you've seen that open up in the Trump era, where the Latinos who prioritize things like rights, democracy, equality, climate, are heavily Democratic, and those who prioritize safety and prices are plurality GOP identifying. So this divide that you've seen in other scenarios, in other contexts, is now applied among Latinos as well, and that is a new phenomenon. But it is the bigger challenge for Democrats, that this isn't just about one election. It's not about what podcast Kamala Harris went on. It's not about what ad she ran. This is larger than an ad. This is about a larger class and culture divide, and a question of, well, who actually is fighting for people like me? I'll say one more thing about this, because there is this MAGA narrative that was written about in the context of 2026, like after trying to explain 2026, trying to explain white working class voters with Trump. And there was this deep story of MAGA that said, these are people who are waiting their turn in line for the American dream. This is Arlie Hochschild, a sociologist. And people are cutting in front of them in line and feeling like Democrats were cheering on the people cutting in front of them in line. That narrative is one that many Latino and even Black and Asian voters came to agree with. It's not a narrative that was designed to explain non-white voters. It was to explain the resentment among white voters. But it turns out that a lot of non-white voters feel that same resentment, maybe for different reasons, right? It's motivated differently. Maybe they have different enemies and different ideas of who's jumping in front of them in line. But the same sense of, I am being passed over, I have been neglected, and now there is someone who is telling me this story and seems to be fighting for people like me who view themselves as protectors and providers.
Yeah, I mean, there's an incredible dynamic that happens during the Biden presidency, which is so many of people who are either seeking asylum or enter the country illegally end up in immigrant neighborhoods or minority neighborhoods in big cities because maybe they don't have the organizing ability to say no, not in my backyard, not in my local hotel, not in my local community center, whatever. And so it becomes a very visual part of urban life. I mean, I have lived in such neighborhoods in New York City. It becomes a very visible part of urban life that there are people who are receiving a lot of benefits from the federal government who, may have come here the wrong way or may have sought asylum the wrong way, and they're being prioritized. And this gets us to a sort of question that I've long had about the role that immigration plays in the entire conversation about Latino voters, which, let's go and just touch the hot stove here. I mean,
yeah.
If you are voting in an American election, you are a citizen. So the question of illegal immigration clearly does not have a direct impact on an individual voter. I understand that there are more Latino citizens who vote who probably have more access or exposure to people who aren't in the country legally, have to deal with sort of the fear and the different indignities that come with that, and so maybe more sympathetic to it. But just sort of as a base level, if you are voting, you are here legally, and therefore this is not something that touches you directly. On top of that, the border issue ends up I've lived in New York City a long time. I've heard Puerto Rican New Yorkers complain that there's Dominicans in their neighborhood and they don't like the way that the neighborhood is changing and blah, 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 blah. It's not inherently obvious that Latino voters would want leniency on the border or necessarily even prioritize a pathway to citizenship over their own economic best interests or the more immediate material concerns that you have described. How did this conversation evolve into a way that it's like, well, if you're talking to the Latino voter, you're talking about immigration?
So I think the mistake we often make is to bundle all aspects of immigration together. There really are multiple dimensions of immigration. There are different fights, even with immigration. There's, even in a given moment, varying levels of credibility of the two candidates, depending on which fight we're having. And the salience of immigration can change tremendously as well. But I think the best way to simplify, to take all these dimensions and narrow it down, it's a framework that comes from a pair of academics, is stock versus flow. That there is how people think about immigrants who are in this country, established in this country, already arrived, versus flow, those who want to come or are coming. And attitudes across lots of national contexts towards stock versus flow are very different. People tend to be much more sympathetic to people who are already in the country versus allowing large numbers to come into the future. Those attitudes are very different. Latinos are not unique in that regard. Latino attitudes on the border can be very different from the ones that they have about something like a pathway to citizenship. So what you have is big immigration fights in 2008 and in 2012, to some extent in 2016, because the conversation Hillary Clinton wanted to have were really about stock. What do we do about immigrants who are already here? You know, in the second Bush term, the focus had been on workplace raids, deporting people who had been working here for a very long time. The fights of this whole period of time tended to be about stock. And on stock, Latinos are very much on the pro-immigrant side of things. It is a place on which they tend to be more distinctive from the rest of the electorate. In fact, even amidst everything else we're going to talk about, Latinos have remained very pro pathway to citizenship. Even Trump voters have remained very pathway to citizenship, favorable toward pathway to citizenship. That has not changed. They have stayed pro-immigrant when it comes to the stock conversation. And in fact, a lot of the resentment in the Biden era, as people were crossing the border, was saying, here are people who are coming today who are, in the perception of these voters, receiving permits, work permits, might be getting other additional benefits beyond that. In New York, you get housing benefits. Some other people were getting some sort of cash benefit. You were an asylum seeker. And saying, well, hold on. Not only is my family struggling, but even my undocumented family, right? My undocumented aunt who's been here for decades hasn't gotten anything. And she's been waiting her turn in line, which, by the way, there's actually no line if you've been undocumented for 20 years. There's no way to regularize it at this point. And so there's a resentment towards that actually is not just about like, oh, I'm just anti-immigrant, but is about a feeling of unfairness. That's not about where you stand overall in immigration, but rather what's the sequence of events in which these should happen. The fight that we then have in 2024 was about the large numbers who were coming into the country. It was, as you talked about, that if you walked around New York, you saw it was a visible presence. And that triggered a very different set of identities and feelings among Latino voters that did others that were actually not so dissimilar from the way other Americans viewed it. They saw it through the lens of safety, law and order, like we should be having an orderly process for people coming into the country, and feeling like that was not happening. And so the debate about 2024 was all a flow fight. And a flow fight just triggers a very different set of identities. I'm not saying that if we'd had a stock fight, all of a sudden Kamala Harris would have done all that much better. You know, that's a different counterfactual. But it's to say there's not a one-to-one connection between views on immigration and how Latinos will vote. But it does kind of give you a sense of which way they're being pushed amidst all the other pressures that they're facing as well.
Well, it strikes me that, I mean, not to get too crude in terminology here, that flow debates affect stock debates, right? It was because of the sense of and not just sense, but reality of chaos at the border and record-breaking numbers of border crossings and the like that makes people change their mind about how to approach immigration enforcement here in the United States. We get to a point at the end of the 2024 cycle where a majority of Americans support mass deportation over a pathway to citizenship when given just those two choices. And so I guess they are, at least in some ways, connected.
But look how quickly we have now pivoted in the second Trump term to having a stock fight again.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because the moment you started having what was perceived as immigration overreach, where people weren't, where Trump was not just targeting criminals, people who'd recently crossed the border, but was kind of indiscriminately going against people who are in the country, so affecting stock, all of a sudden we're having a stock conversation, and you see how attitudes shift incredibly quickly. So yes, the two interact undoubtedly,
Mm-hmm.
Galen. But in the context of 2024, I mean, did we really have a stock fight? We weren't really having a stock fight. Like even when we were talking about mass deportations, and you can look at the Latinos who've moved toward Trump, the way that they perceived what he was saying about deportations, and the way, by the way, that Trump and Vance talked about it when they went on something like Univision, when they were asked about it, really seemed like they were going to focus on criminals and recent border crossers, meaning they tended to talk about it through the lens of flow. And the Harris campaign did nothing to dispel that notion.
GD Politics is powered by you, the listeners. If you enjoy the show, the data-driven analysis, the genuine curiosity and lack of partisan BS, and yes, sometimes the silliness too, please consider becoming a paid subscriber at gdpolitics.com. Paid subscribers help make the podcast possible, and they also get twice the number of episodes and access to the paid subscriber chat where you can send me whatever questions you've got. Independent political media only works if the people who value it support it. So if GD Politics is part of your week, head to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber. That's gdpolitics.com. I so appreciate it. Thank you. I do want to talk more about history and how we've gotten here and so on. But since we're talking about Trump's immigration enforcement in his second term, what has happened? How much have views amongst Latino voters changed in the, bit over a year and a half that Trump has been president again?
And you asked earlier about people's personal experience, right? You said, well, if you're a citizen, how close are you to undocumented immigrants? And one thing is, it's true, most Latinos, most registered Latino voters, so not even just citizens, but people who've gone through the process, are very integrated in the political process. Most don't feel a close affinity to undocumented immigrants. When you ask people, who do you feel socially close to, a way to understand how they identify themselves, right? Who do they group themselves with? Most do not identify with undocumented immigrants. But a big chunk still do. And most swing Latinos, and you could use different categories of swing to get there, do identify with undocumented immigrants. So like a very movable part of the Latino vote is very sensitive to this. So first of all, that's activated. But on top of that, the Trump immigration, it quickly became apparent that it was not just targeting undocumented immigrants, but that it could sweep up people just for being Hispanic. And so all of a sudden, you're activating other identities to which a larger percentage of Latinos do associate. So if you look at the trajectory of the Trump first term, right, he comes in, he's done incredibly well with Latino voters. His first few months, he's in a little bit of a grace period, a honeymoon. And into spring and summer, you have two things that happen. One is Liberation Day. So you have the tariffs. And two, you have Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And it was the most emblematic of a series of very high-profile social media videos that people were seeing that started to show increased, stepped-up enforcement. There was a way that the Trump administration could have done immigration that would have retained incredibly high support. If they had very narrowly focused in on criminals and they had been trotting out criminals that they were deporting, support would have stayed very high for those policies. It was the point.
It's remained high for the border, right? I mean,
it's remained high for the border.
It's generally viewed by even despite literally every single area of Trump's presidency policy area falling off a cliff. You ask people, what about the border? He still gets either neutral or approval. And when you ask Trump versus Democrats, it's like not even close.
Yeah, if you want to see the stock versus flow in effect, you could see that among Latinos, Trump's best issue area is the border. And one of his worst is when you just ask about immigration. That people, when they're asked about immigration today, are thinking in terms of stock of people in the country now. But when they're thinking about the border, they're thinking about it in a very different plane. Just the border is not very salient. So you saw when we ask people their top issue in open ends and then you code it, you can see a spike in immigration and the salience of immigration that happens around Kilmar Abrego Garcia. You see then another spike around Minnesota, where you have the two ICE CBP shootings. So another big spike in immigration in early 2026. And then the economy has been number one throughout all of this, right? So immigration, you see, is a crisis among many crises that Latinos are perceiving under Trump. It is not the thing. There have been points at which it was the topic of the day. There was points at which it was the thing driving discontent, but always contextualized among other parts of chaos that people perceive that Trump were creating. And the economy's in that mix always been at the top of it. Prices driving it. The very thing that Trump wrote into the White House being his worst issue area, and where you see Trump's approval rating among Latinos really start to drop because there's been a period of time where it plateaued, was after Iran, was not after Minnesota.
So it's more economics than immigration at the end of the, I mean, I think we had that sense from
I think
all
it's
that has
cumulative,
happened
right?
over the past. Yeah. Yeah. So last year, after the sort of first election day post Trump's second inauguration, it looks like, looking at Virginia and New Jersey and the like, that there is a significant backlash to Trump amongst Latino voters. In, looking at plurality Latino districts, you can try to get a sense of who's turning out and how they're voting and the like. And then, of course, we've also seen in polls, as you've mentioned, support has fallen off a cliff. You warn in your first piece in The New Dynamic to not overinterpret special elections, off-cycle elections with low turnout and the like. If you had to assess where we are in this moment, are we back at where the equilibrium was in 2020? I mean, I wouldn't call it an equilibrium, but back to where the margins were in 2020 to the best you can. And we have limited data until we have another presidential election. Where do things stand today between the two parties?
So undoubtedly, Democrats have had something of a rebound among Latinos. And you see that in some of the election results we talked about. You see that in some of the polling. We tend to be a little more conservative on this point. Our best read is that, yes, Democrats have rewound the clock somewhat, but not all the way back to 2016 or 2018. The hole is just so deep. It's so much ground to make up from. There were some voters who, for the reasons we talked about before, for those who were around for that part of the conversation and stuck around to hear this part, when I was droning on about like class realignment in Western Europe, there are some people who realigned to their party that is truly their home. They were conservatives. Those people are not going back. They're going to be they were the first in. They're going to be the last out from the Republican Party. There is a higher probably basement than Republicans had coming into the first Trump term. So we see numbers today, for example, in the generic ballot that are a vast improvement over 2024, that are about where 2020, 2022 was. You called it the equilibrium. I think that's fair. I think that's about like where the basement levels are for Republicans at this point. But not so they're not yet numbers, though, that are reaching the highs of 2016 or 2018. But every time I say this, Galen, I get yelled at on Twitter by somebody who is really passionate about a small set of precincts in some special election, like, Texas State District 9. They saw like some Hispanic precincts in like a super low salient special election. And I get that there is like the possibility that it could break open even more. And yet, I think the responsible case right now is to say Trump and Republicans are still holding on to some portion of it with some geographic variation.
And God bless that Twitter user. I hope
God bless them.
Them and all of their friends get to celebrate their small victories. But you've described a dynamic here that is like, once again, I think so much of this is like what's happening with the Latino electorate is happening with the electorate more broadly, but it is exacerbated by certain dynamics. And so we're in a place now where Latino voters used to be turned off pretty sincerely by the Republican Party. They've been turned off in certain ways by the Democratic Party during 2020 and 2024. And there isn't always just this oscillation back and forth from the right to the left. There's a lot of people who get left in the lurch who end up disliking both parties and identifying increasingly as independents. And now we have seen that we're at a record high level of independent identification with the electorate. More broadly, it's 45%, depending on which source you look at. It's either 42, 45% of U.S. adults identify as independent. Any good pollster knows you got to push that 45% to really get them to say how they truly identify or how they usually actually vote. Once you do that 10% of US adults tend to be truly non-leaning independents, but 15% of Latino voters tend to be truly non-leaning independents. And so it seems like we're going to be in a place for a while where more Latinos are up for grabs. More Latinos can be persuaded from one election to the next, whether it's from one side to the other or whether to vote at all. And you sort of like make it clear to political practitioners in your piece, whether they're on the right or the left, there's lots that you can do with the information that we've learned from the past decade. What's your advice to an ambitious Republican or Democrat who wants to perform well going forward?
Yeah, look, to someone who's reading our stuff or listening to this, there's parts of this that can really feel like very academic, which is like, okay, there's long-term forces at play. Those are very slow-moving titanic forces, right? You have this like pull to the right because of culture war, class fights, and you have like a traditional allegiance to the Democratic Party that doesn't go away overnight, right? Like people will still default to it. And so these like larger titanic forces are at war. And yet, as you said, well, there's all of this swing where you are going to have a lot of oscillation still possible from election to election, even while the larger forces, like larger party identification trends might look fairly stable or might be shifting in small numbers. There's still such possibility of movement from cycle to cycle because of the composition of Latino voters. Latinos come by their independence, honestly. There's, as you mentioned, there's double haters, but a lot of this is when you think about who Latinos are, they do tend to be younger than the rest of the population. They also tend to be heavily immigrant. And even though, the API electorate is more immigrant, Latinos are more non-college immigrant, which is yet another way in which Latinos wouldn't be as institutionalized in the partisan process. So you have a lot of Latinos who don't pick up partisanship in the ways that others would. Most people pick it up from their parents. Or if you don't pick it up from your parents, you pick it up from church, or you pick it up from college, or you pick it up from some other institution. A lot of those institutions, including having parents who themselves were in this country participating in politics, are not ones that Latinos avail themselves of. And so even when you have partisan Latinos, it can be a softly held partisanship. Because you have people who came in, kind of adopted the best available option, but it's not been passed on by generations. And all the literature will tell you, like, partisanship will change more, and your willingness to switch parties, you're going to swing more when your life circumstances change. Well, immigrants and young people, their circumstances change a lot. So our estimate is that you have, yes, the point who are really, really independent, or something like 10 to 12%, but you have up to a third of registered Latinos who in one form or another really are persuadable, not just fake on paper, like really truly open to voting, switching from one party to the other. There was a lot of vote switching. It was the number one reason that Trump made his gains among Latinos was Biden voters who voted for Biden in 2020, showing up in 2024 and crossing over and voting for Donald Trump, like real classic swing behavior. And so for campaigns, there's a lot there to be had. Forget the larger long-term forces when you're in the last few months of the campaign and you're thinking about tactics. There is a broader persuasion universe than even like traditional persuasion targeting would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, what does that mean? Like,
what does that mean?
Yeah, like
I can tell you specifically.
Yeah,
campaigns, the way campaigns target, if you think of a classic persuasion target, is like mid to high propensity, so like more likely than not to vote, but not especially partisan, right? Not set in on either side. So like mid-level support scores in the lingo of modeling, and high propensity.
This is like
to
your
vote.
Caricature of maybe a senior citizen at a New Hampshire diner who's really like looking at one column of like pro-con Democrats and another column of pro-con Republicans.
Classic, yes, and exactly. Classic, like suburban soccer mom stuff, right? Like this is the idea. Somebody who's showing up in every election, but is open to changing which party they vote for, depending on who the candidate is and the issues of the moment, et cetera. If you took at who we think are swing Latinos in our latest poll, or our best read who are swing Latinos in this moment, only 4% get caught up in a classic persuasion universe. If you look at the Latinos who vote switched, who defected from Biden to Trump, which I think you and I would agree, that seems like a swing voter to me. Somebody who voted in two different elections, and yet they changed which party they voted for from one to the other. That seems, and it's the biggest swing that happened in 2024. Still, a small percentage of them would have fit in a classic persuasion universe. I did this math. 12% would have ended up in a classic persuasion universe. And so there is a need to kind of break out of the old boxes. If campaigns want to engage what is the new and most dynamic part of the electorate, which are voters who kind of live in this liminal space between turnout and persuasion. They are deciding who to vote for at the same time they're deciding whether they're going to vote at all.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. And I don't want to wrap up without touching on some of the misconceptions that you really highlight that will help us understand moves in the electorate going forward. And it's in particular sort of who is swinging, whether it's more recent immigrants or people whose families have been in the country for a long time, whether it's men and more religious Latinos versus, women or atheists or if you're trying to look at a cross section, because I think, like you point out, that most people tend to think that, it's an assimilation thing. The longer your family has been in the country, the whiter you feel and the more likely you are to vote Republican, for example, because, most white Americans vote Republican. Or that the people who are swinging are mostly sort of men and evangelicals because they're the most cross-pressured and the Republicans are the masculine party and, the more morally traditional parties or evangelicals switch as well. But actually, both of those assumptions are wrong.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about all of these kind of the monochromatic explanations you get of the shifts toward Trump, they all have some germ of truth in them, but you kind of have to widen the aperture, and it's kind of a both and. So look, men and evangelicals did shift toward Donald Trump, but they weren't the only ones to shift, and they didn't shift as much as others. So between 2016 and 2024, women shifted more toward Donald Trump than Latino men did. So the women shifted more over that period of time, and women are also a bigger portion of the Latino vote. So it meant more to Trump's gains than the men. The men tend to be more conservative, but they were already more Republican to start with. So the change wasn't there. Evangelicals shifted, but Catholics and atheists, the unaffiliated, shifted even more. The share of Latinos that are evangelical has not grown in the Trump era. So if you want to understand change, then actually what's more interesting is the trend of unaffiliated, because the share of Latinos who are unaffiliated to any religious denomination has grown, and they shifted tremendously to Trump. So when we focus on these old stories that I know could be very attractive, right? Like it's convenient to talk about like angry men on Reddit forums, or to talk about go into the pews of like a storefront Pentecostal church because it makes for like great story, and yet you're missing a far more complicated, textured story about what's happening among Latinos that actually is also a window into what's happening more broadly among Americans.
You started off by talking a little bit about the role that Latino voters will play in the midterms, and that's certainly something I want to have you back on to talk about. Folks will be paying a lot of attention, I am sure, to Texas and the House districts that you mentioned. So in addition to the midterms, which we will talk more about, what are some of the biggest questions that you want to answer going forward at the new dynamic?
Well, look, we're at the precipice of a whole new era, right? I described the Obama era, described the Trump era. What's this next one? And 2026 is going to be 2026. The mistake would be reading too much into it, because 2028 is a whole new ballgame, and will help get a better sense of which of the trends is going to win out. Is it the traditional Democratic allegiance and a rejection of the way that Republicans governed under Trump, or is it going to be this kind of global rightward pull that you've seen also in parts of Latin America? And 2028 is going to give us a much better read on that. And the parties, though, have some kind of a choice in what happens next. This isn't all, we can't, the reason we can't sit here and predict it all is not just because world events could change, not just because AI could totally transform what we're fighting about in the future, but because the parties have choices they can make. There are ways that Democrats can refashion themselves, can pick the kind of fights that tell Latinos, look, we're on the same team. You are us. And there are things Republicans could do to pick up the banner of America First, which actually was very appealing to a big segment of Latino voters. And there's a version of MAGAism and Trumpism that could appeal to Latino voters. I wouldn't discount that there's still the possibilities that Republicans could gain on where they are right now. And the Latinos we're talking about today, every election is a different set of Latinos. It's not the growth in the churn in the electorate is so much that we're not talking about the same 10 people coming back every single go round. I talked earlier about Obama era was first generation. Right now, we're in a second generation moment among Latinos. The children of immigrants are the predominant force within the Latino electorate today and will be for the next decade. And we still don't know what that's going to mean.
Yeah. Well, luckily we have you to continue to explain it to us. Carlos, we're going to leave things there for today. Thank you so much for joining me. That's Carlos Odillo at The New Dynamic. My name is Galen Druk. Remember to become a subscriber to this podcast at gdpolitics.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Paid subscribers get about twice the number of episodes. You can also join in our paid subscriber chat and pass along questions for us to discuss on the show. And you ensure that we can keep making a podcast that prioritizes curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. Also, be a friend of the pod and go give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Maybe even tell a friend about us. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.